Great. So welcome, everybody. This is the convening of the Just Transition Subcommittee of the Climate Council. And today is Wednesday, the 15th of December, if you can believe it. And I'm going to quickly talk about what we're trying to go through today. But I actually want to do a special announcement first, because I would like to ask Iris to put her to show up on the screen if it's possible. Or are you on the phone, Iris? She doesn't know this. This is a special announcement. There she is. Yeah, she's coming. And I see that Kaya is there. And I wonder, Kaya, if you could just announce to the group the award that Iris has won so that we're all aware. She can't come in, but Kaya can share.
For sure. Well, so I'm so excited to be able to share that this year, 2021, Iris is one of our two Rights and Democracy's two recipients of the Human Rights Award for her amazing work and advocacy in so many different spaces. The fantastic and beautiful movement that you've created through the Vermont Youth Lobby and all of the incredible work you've done throughout the state. She is just so much of a gift to us and has just really changed the lives of everyone that she's worked with. So we are so honored to be able to have her be one of our two honorees across Vermont and New Hampshire. So congratulations, Iris. This is gorgeous. And the recording, oh no, she's gone, but you can.
She's hearing. Everybody take off your mute and yay!
Woo! Yay!
Fabulous. Fabulous. Congratulations.
All right, Iris, we're so proud of you and obviously honored to have you with us. And today we're going to try to quickly run through accepting our minutes. We're going to hear a little bit of an update about what the council is doing. And especially we're going to hear from Kaya about the work she's trying to do around kind of continuing her work as the equity consultant to the council. We're going to have a quick update about ideas on how do we target investments, how do we encourage the council to target investments to disadvantaged communities. And then we're really going to spend the bulk of our time with the topic of public engagement and hearing both what is going on with respect to public engagement with the Department of Environmental Conservation's environmental justice work, as well as the Climate Council's ongoing work with Climate Access, its consultant. But then really, what do we think we should be doing at this moment to achieve these much larger ambitions that we've set up? And then we'll talk at the end about our future meeting schedule. And that is the agenda. So just starting, is anything anyone wants to add or change on that plan? Okay, hearing nothing, I'm just going to make sure that people have had a moment to review or offer any changes, adjustments to the notes of last meeting. And I am going to thank Amanda again for being our note taker and keeping it going, because it's really important work and needs recognition. Any changes, thoughts, concerns?
Sue, I just want to add, Amanda did the tough job of trying to summarize public comment. If people remember, most of our last meeting was public comment. And in reading it, I thought you did a fine job summarizing it. And I also had a reaction where I felt like there's so much that was said that was very hard to capture and feels like it isn't in those minutes, but is clearly in the recording that is posted with the meeting. So I just felt the need to acknowledge that as part of accepting the minutes. Thanks.
Good point. Thank you. Okay. Moving forward, I asked Kelly if she would be willing to kind of do a summary of what's going on at the council. We did have a meeting either this week or last week. Thanks, Kelly.
Yes. So I think since our last meeting of this subcommittee, the council approved and passed the climate action plan, the initial climate action plan. So that was a big deal. David helped us through that process very well, and Jane and Marion did so much to make sure that we got all those edits in one document. So it was a big moment. And the next step for that is there will be some opportunity for a few folks who wanted to dissent on a particular piece. They can write something, and also counselors are able to add some signing statements, just sort of saying, this is how I, why I voted the way I did. But it passed with, let's see, 19-4, I think. So 19 in favor, which was really nice to see. And then we had another meeting on the 7th, I think, where we, the part that probably pertains the most to this committee is we talked a little bit about public engagement and what we'd like to see in the future. A lot of the things that we've been talking about in this community in this committee came up in the council meeting. People, we talked about wanting to make sure that we really were reaching out to more Vermonters, a more diverse group of folks, maybe people who don't necessarily come to these meetings or put their comments into the portal, and working with community leaders and community organizing groups and things to try to reach more people. Those were some suggestions that came up. And I think one counselor also recommended getting more education out there, saying this is what the plan will do, this is what the plan won't do, in case there are people who are concerned about this might have a negative impact on them, making sure that we're really clear about what's included in this, and so people don't have concerns about it, because it's meant to uplift all Vermonters and really support people. And then we talked a little bit about the ARPA money that's coming in from the federal government and what that might mean, and what parts of it could be used for the climate action plan. Some of it's earmarked for climate initiative things, and then some other parts might be able to be used to help some of the programs outlined in the climate action plan. So that's something coming forward where the council will have an opportunity to make some suggestions about how those funds might be used. So that's the next thing that the council will be working on. And then I think that's most of it. Is there anything that I missed that seems important, Jane or Sue or Sarah? I think you were there as well, Sarah. David.
I'm so glad that I asked you to do this, because you remembered so many more things, most importantly, that we actually passed the climate action plan. And I do want to acknowledge the incredible work that staff did, especially, Jane and Marion, but also David, on managing a difficult and emotional meeting. But I don't think I have more to add, but I will be returning to this question of the ARPA funding and recommendations that we might want to make later on in this agenda. Any other additions? Did a good job. I also want to mention—
I just say the acronym ARPA is just, if folks don't know, that's just a particular pot of federal money. It came out as pandemic related federal money. So that's what that acronym refers to. It's not the infrastructure bill. Yeah.
The American Rescue Plan. We are going to rescue America. All right. I see more people coming, and because I rushed forward, I want to just ask us all to do our in the chat acknowledgement of who we are and something you're grateful to. Sarah started that, and that's now my favorite thing, remembering gratitude. So if you have a minute to introduce yourself in the chat, so people know who you are, because we want to include the public in our introductions. Okay. Thank you for that. And I'm going to move forward to really asking Kaya to give us an update and sort of a refresher on what she's accomplished to date and where she's going from here, and some specific feedback she'd like from us. Thank you, Kaya.
Hi, all. So for those who don't know me, and for the record, Kaya Morris, I use she, her pronouns, and I am the equity consultant supporting the Climate Council and the subcommittees with the Climate Action Plan and work relating to that. So we've been on one heck of a journey to December 1st to getting the plan out the door. And through this time have been working with the subcommittees individually, as well as with some different smaller groups on trying to look at ways to build in equity using the guiding principles and the questions that were created coming from the sort of guiding questions that took the principles and then put them into a way for a thought process on how do we encapsulate what the principles are seeking From that, we then created a tool, a scoring rubric as well, that the questions could be used with the tool in tandem to really try to dive deeper into the areas where there's opportunities for equity and the areas where more work is needed to be able to really do the work that we're seeking and the just transitions that we're seeking. As you know, this has been one heck of a process. It has been very challenging at times, really, really difficult conversations that look different in each and every committee and in the council itself. So now that that piece is done, I'm at the stage now of kind of doing an assessment report to synthesize a lot of the different observations that were made, the notes that happened, the challenges that took place as we were trying to deliberate how to build an equity often in proposals where they're creating worlds that don't exist. So they're not necessarily not every single thing that went into the cap had a deep, robust, rich, body of research behind it and data that was really strong, even though there were things that we both inherently knew. We had some preliminary information around, but that we wanted to go more deeply into seeing what that means to put it into implementation, how it will impact the lives of all living beings within Vermont. So that speaking through that work and thinking through what that process was like, I'll be able to speak a little bit about some of the differences that happened from committee to committee, as well as looking at some of the dynamics within the committee as those deliberations took place. Within this report, I've also sought out, and you all are welcome to join this as well. There's been a link that should have been shared with everyone that went out earlier this week. I have some availability this week if people want to have one-on-one conversations. The information that will be received is obviously kept anonymous and it is scrubbed, but it is helpful as far as having a more deliberative dialogue to be able to do that kind of self-reflection on this is how I saw equity happening, or these are concerns that I might have. This is what it was like trying to use the tools within this work and really trying to embody those principles. The last piece of this, which is what I'm asking for some of your support on today, is an actual assessment. So it's a survey. And I've tried to get really specific in some different ways within the survey, asking really intentional questions to get down to saying, what was your experience on using the tool within these different environments? How did it vary in your observation from what happened within committee dialogues or what may have happened within the council itself? How was equity held within the committee deliberations? Did you feel like you were able to use your voice in that space, or did you choose to not? There was great variance on that. There were some voices that were incredibly vocal, and there were others that even as I'm going through the interview processes, I'm like, I feel like I'm meeting you for the first time. And I've sat in hours of these meetings and we haven't had a chance to really cross paths. So I think this is an excellent opportunity that I would like to seek your support with. And by saying this, I do want to acknowledge that within the way that we had the scope of the contract and the RFP was originally written, there was intended to be more interactivity between this position as the equity consultant and the Just Transition Subcommittee. Much of this had to do with just the timing of everything and how we could get things done or not done. But now is a point where I think yourselves, of having lived through this, it could be truly helpful for me to hear both your perspectives with regards to the survey that I would like to launch fairly soon, and for the report itself before it goes out. So for each of the other committees that had a technical consultant, there was an opportunity for the committees themselves to kind of take a look at the reports and provide feedback on them and such, as this report will be public record. So that is kind of the high level overview of what I have. And you should have been sent a copy of the survey language, which again, it's still in draft form and we have not hit the send button for everybody to start filling this out. And it is potentially different than another survey that I think Jane may talk to you about. That's more broadly, this is what happened within the overall process over the past year or so of us doing this work. So, yeah, so I will pause there. And if folks want to ask questions or if you have thoughts, how you want to go about talking about these things, talking about the survey itself or anything like that. I'm happy to share what I can.
Any questions, thoughts, feedback on the survey or the process in general? I'm curious, sort of, I know you've done some one-on-ones. Have you had a good response from that, or do you feel like you have a long way to go for that kind of engagement?
Well, of course, I love more. I love a big N size. Those things make me happy. Statistical significance feels great in my world. But it's been a decent spread, I would say, of folks, both from administration as well as counselors, subcommittee members, those sorts of things it's been a broad sweep. I think as a factor of time, it was a challenge because we were rounding the corner to that December 1st deadline. And so now hopefully more will take advantage of this opportunity to be able to speak. But those who may not, there is plenty of narrative space within the survey that I think they can also hopefully give them an opportunity to say what they might not have in a private interview.
Any other questions? So the link, can we get the link to the survey in the chat? I know it came out with the agenda.
I haven't posted it because it was draft. So it was, Sarah sent it out in an email on Tuesday if folks are looking for it. Happy to post it if that'd be helpful, but I did not because it was draft.
Yeah, I just received it just recently myself. Yep.
So Kaya, you're waiting.
Yeah,
I'm just making sure, Kaya, you're not ready. Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I didn't raise my hand. I apologize about that. Kaya, I just want to say thank you so much for making yourself available for people to provide, be in conversation with you about it, and then also for thinking about doing the survey and giving options for people. I think it's just such a great example of living into what our subcommittee's been all about, which is multiple ways of connecting, and I really appreciate that. For my part, I thought the survey was fantastic and really look forward to seeing how people respond. I think it will give our subcommittee a lot of good feedback and information to chew on about how to move forward and how to continue to improve. So thank you.
And if I may take the liberty, something that I have to do, my karmic spirits, like having a really tough time with this, I need to give attribution to you, Sarah, and to Iris as well. So as much as I am so proud to have been a part of creating the scoring rubric and the guiding questions, y'all did so much high level editing and everything on that, that it wouldn't exist without your labor. And the, just the whole project, everything about it has been really beautiful, but I must give attribution where it is due, or I will not have a good, it'll be bad. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you, Sarah and Iris as well, for so much of that labor that you put in. So thank you. Sorry to divert. I wanted to get back to the survey. I just had to throw it in since everybody's on the line.
Thank you, Kaya. And it was such a group effort, though. Yes, thank you. Thanks for that. And Iris put in perilous hours on top of going to school. I'm inspired.
I have a quick question. Kaya, how did the other subcommittees actually use our guiding principles and rubric? Were they stumbling through it, or was the process, did they actually use it? Or was it just like a general reference tool?
So what we did is I did a few different sessions. So to start off, I kind of had to remind folks a little bit. There was a really great crosswalk on going through and saying these are the different forms of equity. If we think about procedural equity, and justice, and getting folks regrounded with it, because that was a little bit of the challenge, is that we sort of brought it to them at the beginning. Folks got deep into it, and did they reflect back on it at any point in time? So then after that point, the way that we did it in the subcommittees is each subcommittee, we had one recommendation that we did together as a group. So I guided them through let's try to answer as many of the guiding questions as we can. And so the way that it was set up was to say, we're going to use the guiding questions to start brainstorming and pulling out what we think are the needed answers, what we do or we don't know. The rubric then gives us a chance to reflect on those answers and say, how do we think we did? So we went through for each of the subcommittees, had one that we did all as a group. And then we broke into breakout groups, except for ag and ecosystems, because that didn't really work out for them, and which was fine. We did them together. And there were pluses and minuses to doing it both ways. But as a factor of time, we then broke people out into subcommittees. And subcommittees into breakout groups. And they went through 2 other recommendations per breakout group. It was all recognizing we were not going to get all the way through any of them. And that there was going to have to be work outside of the committee meetings in order to even try to tackle it, but to at least get them familiarized with thinking it through. So then kind of went through and had those who were considered to be the task leads for a particular recommendation. So whether it was like weatherization, or if it was clean heat standard, or different aspects of forestry, for example, that would reintroduce the concept to the group so that everybody would sort of have a familiarity with the recommendations, because that's a piece, is that some of this work was happening not always in a group setting. So you could never assume that everybody in the subcommittee had a clue what was happening, what even the recommendations meant. So getting everyone up to speed on that, and then going through and starting to try to answer the questions. Some groups did better than others. It depended on the composition of the folks in the groups. There were some folks that wanted to stay kind of in a high level place, and there was one member that I got really frustrated because they wanted to share screens and show a lot of graphs and data instead of answering the questions. For the most part, it's group dynamics. So, but for the most part, people tried to dive in as quickly as they could. Some groups were able to answer the questions more fully, whereas others were not, because again, so for example, agriculture and ecosystems, it took them so long to get to a point of even understanding where equity and inequity was happening within the proposals they were coming forth and in their procedures of the subcommittee itself, that their ideas were still at the beginning stages. Whereas you'd see other committees like cross-sector, for example, that everybody already came in knowing what they wanted to talk about. They had special technical consultants that were helping them to draw everything that they needed. So they were able to, on some levels, and I still will not say that anyone got it done. I won't say that anybody should be able to show their guiding questions or their rubric at this point in time and say it's done.
Uh-oh.
Are you still there? We lost your picture. I want to ask a follow-up, because I was asked by a member of the media, whether there was really any impact. And so,
sorry.
Did we lose you as a whole?
You did lose me. I was full on out of the call. So I apologize. I was just saying that the other piece of that I think was important is that I don't know that any subcommittee or any recommendation fully got the chance to go through this, but that was what I got the most from so many, even in these one-on-one interviews, and I'm sure we'll see similarities within the surveys, is that so many really, really wanted to do this work. They really wanted to answer the questions. They really wanted to be prepared. So as the public says, did you consider X, Y, or Z, or where are the voices of these folks, that they had they had those answers ready, and they just weren't able to. But there's still, I believe, distinct opportunities for that to happen moving forward. And especially as the legislature wants to start looking at this work, they specifically want to look and utilize these tools as a function of saying effective date, great, when you get this done. Certain effective dates can happen, but other pieces will need to have this equity assessment before we can get to the point of saying they're completely ready. So I hopefully that helps give kind of like an overview of how that process went.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure.
Jane?
Well, I was just going to highlight, based on the conversations that Kaya was able to have with the subcommittees, if you weren't able or didn't pick up on this in the climate action plan, you'll see that a distinction was made sort of at the 11th hour by two of the subcommittees that the rubric would be applied at the strategy level rather than at the action level. And then of course, the subcommittee cross-sector, which did you do it at the action level, did it in a way that was more qualitative than anything else, like whether or not they hit every question. So I do think there was varying success at how it was applied across the subcommittees, and perhaps it wasn't that one applied it more successful. It was just an appreciation by Ag and Eco and Rural Resilience that there wasn't enough information to do it at the action level. So let's not try to force a square peg in a round hole because we don't know yet the details. So I think it just really points to its continued application. And I know it was brought up, I testified in House Transportation yesterday, and after me was the sector leads testified and referenced using the guiding principles and scoring rubric, and legislators were asking, well, how did you evaluate equity? What was the scoring rubric? And there's since been follow-up with those particular legislators to see what we did and what we need to do more of, which was great to have their interest in that. But I just thought I'd share that it was different for the different subcommittees at the scale of what they applied it to.
Well, thank you, Jane, and most of all, thank you, Kaya. This is a continuing conversation. The rubric for you, the survey for you to give your input into is a part of what you received as the agenda. And at some point, it'll be complete and then sent back out, I assume, for people to actually fulfill. Good. All right. Anything more for Kaya or with Kaya? Okay.
I'll just add one thing if I could real quick. I'll just say that survey, and Kaya alluded to this, we sort of have two surveys in the works. Kaya's specific survey to close out this component of her work with us to finalize and write up an overarching summary to help guide and inform our work in the space going forward, and then to consider if there's a role for a consultant like Kaya going onward. But that will sort of wrap up this component of the work with a findings report from these conversations and survey. And then just wanted to say that, yes, there's another survey in the works, more around process, reflecting on counselors really wanting to hone in on what worked and what didn't work, recognizing and appreciating that this past year was hopefully not a process that we're going to replicate again, largely because I think it was a unique circumstance, but there's certainly lessons to be gleaned that we can apply as we move forward.
Got it. Yeah, and I think this will continue on, and we'll be having that discussion later on in the agenda. I want to just conclude that piece and move for a few minutes to the topic on our agenda called Targeting Climate Investments. And this is sort of relating to what Kelly described as a major part of a discussion at the Climate Council around the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and funding. The state received over $1 billion for COVID recovery. And that has kind of been put into sort of buckets of areas of investment. And among those buckets across the state, affordable housing and broadband and other things, is climate. And as I recall, it's a $200 million investment. This is never in a generation have we had such an opportunity. So the Climate Council is going to, I think, as I understand it, submit kind of a high-level paper, maybe on sort of criteria or big ideas, direction. I think we kind of decided we weren't going to get deep into weeds, but to help direct what happens with those dollars. And so there was a lot of good discussion, and I wanted to mention that I advanced something that we all talked about. In fact, I was just looking at my plan and read it specifically identified, we have a section in the plan about implementation. and specifically around just transitions. And it talks a lot about public engagement, which we're about to talk about. But right now, it also talks and mentions that we wanted to encourage the legislature to mitigate burdens and maximize benefits for impacted communities in climate-related legislation and investment, which could include establishing a minimum percentage of climate action investments for impacted communities. So knowing we had talked about this, and this was in the plan, I put that out there as a concept that we might want to include in this letter. And I guess I wanted feedback and engagement from you around that idea. And specifically, you may or may not recall way back when we did a scan of other states in our region working on this just transition concept. The state of New York had a minimum threshold of investment for impacted communities, and it was a 35%. And right now with the new Biden, not so new, but the Biden administration has a whole program, Justice 40, coming through the Environmental Protection Act. And that looks at a 40% threshold of impact, impacted communities. So I wonder if we want to, if you support this idea, I hope, but whether you want to be specific, what you want to put forward as a possible point of focus and direction for targeted investments in impacted communities. So I just wanted to open up for discussion there. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Does that sound like something worth advancing? I think I see Kashka, and I think I see Iris trying to speak. Iris, if you're speaking, I don't hear you. No, you're not. Okay, go ahead, Kashka.
Oh, so I just had a question. So are you asking for comments regarding the ARPA money being spent towards public engagement or towards, ideas to help offset the cost or the, the cost and everything associated with frontline communities and the effects on frontline communities?
Thanks for the question. I guess I wasn't particularly clear because I've said both things. Let's put aside the question of public engagement because we are going to have that. This is really about, do you want to support the idea of a threshold of investment toward impacted communities of the 200 million or of a particular program? That's we don't do that generally these days, but should we be advancing that for this work? So let's say there's a new program. The new program is putting forward $1 million. 35% or 40% of that would be targeted explicitly for impacted communities as we've, potentially as we've defined them in our just transitions. I see Jane and then Chris.
Well, I just wanted to draw people's attention to the document. If you want to scroll through it in the chat, that is the guidance that has gone out to subcommittees that speaks to the what we're able to glean from the extremely vague at times ARPA guidance that we have in Vermont about what it can and can't go to. But there is a high priority. All projects are intended to have a focus on low income Vermonters. And then second, the projects are supposed to be implementation infrastructure focused. So people say infrastructure focused, but it doesn't necessarily mean infrastructure in a traditional way. It really has to be like project ready on the ground because the intent is to create jobs out on the ground. So that's in there. And it also speaks to what we hope to prepare for the governor and legislature around a memo that really sets up and tees up these overarching principles of how ARPA dollars related to climate action should be prioritized. And then after that, speak to some considerations of buckets of work that we see as high priorities coming out of the climate action plan. But I really see your section and what Sue is proposing, which is mentioned in the document, the guidance that I shared as front and center for the guidance that we would intend to share to the governor and legislature, setting that threshold or speaking to it in a way that is in line with what you all support would be really key to bringing that forward to craft that memo, not the specific actions that come from rural resilience or ag and eco and cross sector, but really setting the stage for how those dollars will go on the ground in Vermont.
Thank you, Jane. I haven't looked at that document. I'm sorry if I was sent it before. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'm going to get a little bit into weeds here. And so bear with me. I am totally supportive of the concept. What I'm trying to figure out is under ARPA is what that looks like. The regional planning commissions, along with Vermont League of Cities and Towns, is helping municipalities kind of understand the ARPA pathways and what they can do with the funds and not. And I think the same general rules apply to the state. And one of the things, and Jane, maybe you have an answer to this. I've been trying to understand in the document that Jane shared with everybody, it says serve low-income Vermonters. And Sarah, you might know this too, and others. What I'm trying to figure out is I'd reached out to Katie Buckley in the RPC and VLCT roles. VLCT has really been kind of teasing out Vermont League of Cities and Towns, how the rules apply, what the rules mean. The RPCs are really kind of helping the municipalities with their internal processes to try to figure out, identify projects and figure out what they want to do. So I reached out to Katie, and based on her understanding, it's not really been well defined, but generally speaking, Treasury guidance is tracked with HUD rules, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which funds the community development block grants. And the question I've got is for the serving low-income Vermonters, is that talking about at the household level, or is that talking about like what would under HUD programs would be low to moderate income qualifying census tracts, which would be in our region be limited pretty much to Bellows Falls and Brattleboro. And my concern is, what I'm trying to tease out is that makes a difference in how these programs are applied and the geography that they'll ultimately address. So Sarah, do you have any, do you know?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I think, Chris, thanks. That's a good question. And I think the general response, I'm going to channel Doug Farnham here, who's from the Agency of Administration, kind of overseeing these funds. I think the general response is that the state actually has a lot of discretion in how it approaches defining low income. In some cases, it will mean community. In some cases, it will mean household. In projects that serve multiple households, it will mean a certain portion of those households. There's other ways to get at it. You're right that Treasury, I think that a good practice is relying on following back on how other parts of the federal government define low income, whether it be at the community or the household level. But that being said, the federal government in its many different programs uses many different ways to fall back on that. You're also right that when it comes to certain kinds of projects that they've sort of created a default. In other words, they've said, here's a default. Like if you rely on what you were saying, Chris, like the QCTs, the qualified census tracts, there aren't very many in Vermont, but it's a default that those communities are sort of auto-qualified. But in Vermont, we have other ways that we look at sort of qualifying communities based on demographics or geography or income or other things. So I think there's a lot of flexibility. I gave you the level of detail I think you want, but probably more than most people want.
And I guess I want to not let us go into too many deep weeds, especially because this particular document that we're trying to weigh in on is going to stay super high level. But Chris, your questions are critical, obviously, once we get to the implementation. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is the spirit. Jane, I'm now opening this. What is it that you think would be helpful to hear from the committee based on what it is that you think is being crafted?
Well, I mean, you can see, I think that we'll want to make a statement around how we direct the funding above and beyond what what we say is low income. So there's a broad statement that all the subcommittees are working on actions that speak to the most equitable actions that have benefits to marginalized communities. But I also think that there's some language or statements that we can pull into that overarching memo that speaks to we're clearly directing all of our priorities in these areas because it's important for these ways. So we can pull in right now, it references the two different policies that you spoke to, the Justice 40 and New York, what New York has done, but it doesn't go as far as to say if Vermont wants to do anything similar more broadly.
I see a question from Iris in the chat. Can we actually suggest the use of the scoring rubric? My question was maybe higher level, that we spent a lot of time defining frontline communities, and at a minimum that might be, certainly broader than low income. But as to, can we get into actually using the kind of the equity principles? Another important question.
Yeah, I just want to respond quickly to Iris because I wish that I had said that explicitly in the memo already. I'm an oversight on my part that I should have named that in the memo and guidance to the subcommittees. But maybe we can, I'm trying to backwalk what I already have asked subcommittees to do. I wish I had them do it. But we could speak very clearly to the definition that Sue is that you all put together for the guiding principles for frontline impacted communities, and then from there also make specific reference to the scoring rubric as the governor and legislature considers ideas further reaching out and considering application of the scoring rubric as programs are like more architecture, because some of the problems with the scoring rubric has been how much specificity the actions have to actually run them through the scoring rubric.
I'm going to ask Chris to make his statement, and then I'm going to say we don't really have a lot of time on the agenda for this, and this day is really about public engagement. So we've whetted our appetite. Go ahead, Chris, and then we'll try to close up this part of the agenda.
Yeah, I'll be real quick. I don't want to dominate. I'm even at a local and regional level, I'm just trying to figure all this out. So to Iris's point, to both Sue and Iris, I would say yes on both proposals. The question that I've got is, and this is something that I think the committee just needs to have on its radar, is there are like immediate near-term goals that can be accomplished with this funding. But we're trying to figure out, like on the transportation realm, could this go towards helping getting people to lower, higher mileage cars and that kind of thing? Could it help with weatherization? Could it help with electrical service upgrades? So that's like at the household level. The other issue that we've got here that I just want to put out for people to ponder, there's no magical answer to this, this is also like once in a life generation opportunity for really transformational change, and like investing in the actual infrastructure that it would take to actually build like rural affordable housing at a meaningful scale. And this is not hyperbole. Without the infrastructure to support that, you're not going to ever have it. And we don't have, the downtowns can't all take it. And so there are some really deep discussions that we as a state need to have about how do you couple all of these funds so that in the end, yes, we're meeting needs at the household level, but on the other side, for current and future households to actually produce the affordable housing that's needed, where is it going to go absent the infrastructure to actually support it? Because otherwise you're very limited where you're going to be able to put the housing. And that also gets into other things like the transformational change to actually achieve the compact settlements to in the future, reduce vehicle miles traveled, make walking and biking the preferred option, all of that groovy stuff. So I just wanted to put that out there for people to ponder, because there are fundamental just transitions out there, including, I would say, just transitions in Vermonters' lifetimes. Like, if you're a young person, where are you going to live as you have a family? Where are you going to live as you become an empty nester? Where are you going to live as you're trying to age in place? Where are you going to live? And right now in Vermont, it is profoundly unfair because we've just not invested in the infrastructure to support the housing.
Thanks, Chris. I see, again, I want us to remember we're looking at big top level concepts to go into a paper, as I understand it, a letter that the council is drafting that tries to bring principles. And maybe from what I heard Chris say, it's about those transformational changes in building communities that are compact and affordable. Kashka. And then this will be the last comment. We have to move forward and allow the public to comment as well. Go ahead, Kashka.
So can everybody hear me? Sorry. I just wanted to make sure and just underline in this document that has to come forth, the qualification for low income or frontline communities. That is extremely important. So whenever we decide how those dollars are spent or where they're gone, we need to really define the qualification, because as of right now, and like federal versus state, et cetera, and be very clear about it, because that determines so much. That determines whether a family decides to have the mother go to work or not go to work. That determines whether or not a family gets subsidy for this A, B, C, or D. So there's just so much regarding the qualification system and that threshold of what defines low and frontline community. So, and it's been broken in the past and it is broken right now. So I wonder how we can really think about either changing that or defining it in a way where it doesn't leave such a cliff for families. Thank you.
Yes, good point. Thank you. The cliff is real and such a problem. Thank you, Kashka, and everyone else on this discussion. I see Pat, and that is a good segue to having time now for public comments. We're going to have about 10 minutes. So if you are a member of the public who would like to comment, please do raise your hand so I can call on you next, but I'll begin with Pat.
Hi, thank you. I had two things. One, I didn't get where I can get a copy of the report, Kaya's report. I didn't see it in the chat, and I understood that you all got it, but where will the public be able to get it? So perhaps somebody can address that. And then I did review the revised scope of work for public engagement, and I really just have one comment about it, and that in reading it, I remembered an early conversation. I think, Sue, you were the one to say that that this process was going to be very different than other policy development processes. It was going to look different. And when I read this revised scope of work, it looks like business as usual. That the outreach will be primarily to share and educate Vermonters about the priorities and to respond to their questions. That's not what I recall as the engagement that this group talked about in the beginning. And either I've missed something and I welcome being corrected, or if someone can address what looks like a really dramatic change, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm happy to respond, but first I want to make sure there's any other comments from the public at this moment. Pat, I think you're raising the crux question of us tonight. We're going to move, unless someone from the public is wanting to say something. The next part of our discussion is really about understanding what Climate Access is doing as part of the state contract that you reviewed, understanding ever so briefly what's happening also with our Department of Environmental Conservation around environmental justice, and then us having a conversation to go back to our aspiration that Pat referred to. What do we think we should be doing to actually do something different at this time, in addition to these other things that you're going to hear about? So let's put a pin in what we remember talking about before, learn a little bit about what's going to be happening in the next whatever X months. I am going to hand this over to David because he's going to help facilitate this deeper conversation about what we would like to see. Thanks.
Super. Okay. Thanks, Sue, and thanks, everybody. Okay. So as Sue says, I think the way to start off this conversation is just signaling what you all have said already and what the council has said around public engagement and what that looks like going forward. So I thought I'd just share some quick sort of excerpts from the documents that you've produced and others as a way of getting into the conversation. And then we'll hear a little bit more from these other pieces of the puzzle. And then I think the challenge for you all as a Just Transitions Subcommittee is to say, well, how can we make this work with the resources we have and the resources we think we should have. Let me just share my screen for 1 second. I just did. Just give me 1 second to get it going. Where did it go? Okay. All right. So I just have 2 slides, and this is the first one. This is language pulled directly from the Climate Action Plan. There's a piece at the end around implementation, and you all helped to craft some language to go in there about public engagement. You had some other pieces in there about using the Just Transition guiding principles and the rubric, but I just put the emphasis is mine. All right, so I did the I put the orange text in there in terms of emphasis, but this is the language that actually is in the Climate Action Plan, right? So just just as a remembering of what has been said, and this language came from you all as a Just Transition Subcommittee, and then the full council pulled it in, right? And so you talked about innovative engagement strategies, you talked about materials that are plain and accessible language and also in different languages. You talked about ensuring materials and resources are easy to navigate. You talked about engagement that is empowering and ongoing. And you talked about using trusted organizations and community members, right? And then at the end here, you talked about, again, supporting and working through and with trusted community organizations. And that's going to require some coordination. It's going to require some support. Okay, so this is in the actual Climate Action Plan. I excerpted pieces, so it's not the full text, but just pieces of it, and the emphasis is mine. And then, as Kelly mentioned, the council met on the 7th of this month, and one of the pieces of the conversation at the top of the meeting was, what does the council envision as particularly meaningful engagement going forward? And again, these same themes came out. I again just pulled out a few of the concepts. There were some other things as well that were said, but using resourcing trusted community organizations as pathways in, really thinking about people and communities that are not typically consulted as part of these processes. And then a particular emphasis, and I think Kaya was putting some emphasis on this, is one thing is going out and doing all this good work. The other is, how are you very intentionally synthesizing it and pulling it into the work of the council going forward, so that sort of how you make sense of it all and bring it into your conversations. So those are things that have already been said. And so I think what we do now as we walk through this sort of pieces of the puzzle is we think, okay, how do we do this work in the way we've said we'd like to do it? What needs to happen now with the resources we have now? what's the vision going forward, right? Those are kinds of things that you've talked about so far. That was just the opening piece I wanted to do. We have two pieces of the puzzle in terms of immediate sort of resources or things that are going on to help spark our thinking. One is what Climate Access is doing or maybe doing, and the other what's going on at DECD, and that's who is here from, is Claire going to do that, right?
Carrie.
Carrie's going to do that, excuse me. Carrie will do that. So I don't have a particular suggested order. I don't know if Jane or others have a particular suggested order about these sort of pieces of the puzzle that we want to share as we get into this conversation.
Why don't we start with Climate Access? I see them here.
Great.
I know Carrie's here as well. And,
Okay.
you know, we're trying to kind of stay high level what you're doing. The details have been submitted, but thank you very much for being here and supplementing our work, directing it.
Right. So Kara, take it away, please.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So as Pat mentioned, one of the goals for the next phase of public engagement is to share and educate people about the plan. It's a very large, in-depth document that takes a bit of effort to work through. So making it accessible, sharing that out. But as importantly, to get input on the plan as the council is considering further revisions and A&R. And then finally, to direct people to actions that they can take, including engaging with their legislators as policies are being considered, but other steps they can take in their communities and homes. So there's three pieces to that, the education being one of them. This work has already started. We prepared a summary of the plan for the release on December 1st. So the 250 plus pages of the plan, we boiled down into 4 pages of narrative and then charts outlining the pathways, strategies, and actions for each of the major issue areas, and worked with A&R on a press release and social media push. So what we're doing moving forward, ongoing social media, but also per the points that David raised, looking to go back out to the list of community organizations that we put together and gauge interest in partnering around sharing and getting input on the plan via social media, websites, as well as events. And that's definitely something we want to talk with Just Transition about. We do have a list already that was shared that you all helped put together, as well as the other subcommittees of more than 70 different community organizations. We'll email the whole list, but ideally would like to prioritize where there needs to be more direct follow-up and engagement around collaboration. So ideally working with Just Transition on that effort. Also in our scope of work is to host 3 online meetings articulating how Vermonters can engage with this next phase of the plan. As part of that, we're putting together an online platform that will break the plan into pieces that makes it really easy to move through and digest, as well as give people an opportunity to weigh in on the plan. We'll be developing materials as needed, and then summarizing the input and returning it to you and the council should any revisions to the plan be made. So that's what we have sketched out. What has been, we've shared the presentation deck and facilitation guide with you. Those are things that would be really helpful to get your input on. That I don't think we need to spend time in this conversation, but if you could email Meredith at climateaccess.org with any input on the materials, that would be great. And these are really intended to help with the events that we're organizing, but also partner outreach and any events that Just Transition chooses to organize. We'd love to partner with you on that outreach to community organizations. Should organizations want to have a representative from Just Transitions or A&R to come and speak, that's something we'd like to be able to offer. But also if there are organizations you have a relationship with and you want to be proactive with, but we can help you and support you with that effort. So we've sketched out a number of questions. I'll just walk through them now, but then turn it back to David regarding how you want to facilitate the dialogue. But as said, would be very helpful to have your help on the groups that should be prioritized for partner outreach. And I do want to flag that we have funds available to organizations who want to take this on. So want to really make sure that's clear. To sort out with you how we would like to collaborate on this next phase of the engagement. It's been raised whether or not there should be a BIPOC affinity event. That's not in our plans with the 3 events, but that has been raised as a question. And I think that's something important for Just Transitions to consider. And then how can we, along with A&R, support what you would like to do in this next phase?
That's really, really clear, Kara. Thanks so much. My thinking is before we dive into those really good questions, I wonder if we want to hear from Carrie first and then have a conversation, because I think those questions are really good guiding questions for the overall conversation we want to have. So I think is my preference. And so what I'd love to do maybe is in a second, post those in the chat as a way to guide our conversation. So we were also, in a way of sort of seeding this conversation, going to hear from Carrie. There you are. Excellent. Just making sure you're here. I didn't want to tee you up and you weren't here. About the work that's happening over in your shop and on this as a way of, another piece of this puzzle for the council and the Just Transition Subcommittee. So Carrie, let me turn it over to you to explain a little bit more what it is you're doing and why you think it could be helpful for the work of the Just Transition Subcommittee.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. I know I've been in and out of this committee as staff support, so a lot of you probably don't even know really what I'm doing in my day job at the DEC. But I basically got involved in environmental justice around 2016, 2017, because the department was not really doing anything. And EPA started asking some questions about what we were doing. And in my role, I became the environmental justice coordinator and started working with EPA and some external stakeholders about developing an environmental justice policy for the DEC. And we had made a commitment to do this, I think by the fall of 2021. I think in our minds, we thought, oh, 2 years, that's good. That's enough time to do outreach and develop a policy. And we quickly realized that our urgency to develop a policy was not the same urgency that the communities we were trying to help had. In fact, they asked us to slow down. They asked us to be more thoughtful. And so, we had to sort of look at ourselves and say, you know what, we have not been doing this work ever. We should have started it in the 90s. And so we can't expect to fix it right away. So, we sort of pushed back on our leadership, pushed back on the EPA and said, we really need to engage the people and hear their voices in order to move this forward. And that's not the way we usually do business and approach our policy development and problem solving and public outreach. So that's sort of like how we got where we are. I don't know that you want the whole background of all the things we're doing at the DEC right now, because we are engaged in a lot of different things. But I just wanted to give you a quick overview about a contract. We initiated it in August for community engagement. And am I able to, I think I'm able to share my screen. And I'm going to go through this quick because I know that time is, can you see my screen? Okay. Because time, all right, I'm just going to show it to you this way. So basically what we're doing is we have a contract with the Center for Whole Communities. We issued an RFP with what we were looking for. We are contracted with the Center for Whole Communities, and they have a consultant team, which includes staff from Rights and Democracy Institute. Kaya is one of the staff that works on this project, along with others from the Vermont Law School. Many of these partners on the project are also partners of Rejoice, which I think some of you have heard from Rejoice, Rural Environmental Justice Opportunities Informed by Community Expertise. They are working on this. So it's a way of supporting their work and building our work and trying to do it at the same time. So this is a pilot project. We're calling it a pilot project targeted to 3 to 5 communities in Vermont, both identity and geographically based. And we're calling it a pilot project because it is not a typical community engagement project, and nothing like the type of typical engagement with public meetings that we would be doing at the DEC. Through this contract, 30% of the funds that we're awarding to the Center for Whole Communities are going back into the community members by paying cultural liaisons, key informants, and people to take surveys and participate in community events, along with other things like childcare and meals. You know, and one thing that we learned at the DEC is that there is some vulnerability and trust that needs to happen with this type of project, in that we're not controlling the outcome. And I think sometimes from the government standpoint, especially when you're trying to implement a project that's atypical, it can be hard and a little bit scary for decision makers to let go of control. And we all know letting go of control and sharing decision making is a big part of moving equity forward. So there's 3 main tasks in this contract. I just copied this in at the last minute, so I don't expect you to read it. But basically, task 1 is the planning phase of this contract is pretty in-depth. It's like a 5 or 6 month planning phase before any outreach happens at all. So we did select the communities for outreach with the contractor. Right now, it's subject to change, but it's elderly residents in Northeast Kingdom mobile home parks, New Americans in the Burlington and Winooski area, and the Bennington BIPOC community. Now that those have been selected, the contractor is drafting targeted community engagement plans. So for each community, there's going to be a very specific plan developed for how they're going to conduct the outreach, which is sort of left to their own creativity and the information that they receive from the cultural liaisons on how to best communicate. Something that I wanted to point out though in here, which is why I copied it in here, is in this first task that in the planning phase, the contractor is supposed to communicate with the Climate Council. We knew when we were drafting this contract, it was around the same time the Climate Council was contracting for their community outreach. We knew there was a possibility for some overlap. So we just wanted to make sure that the 2 groups were communicating, especially if they both intended to reach out to similar populations. Okay. So I think this is probably for this group the more interesting part of what we're doing and what's in the contract, to use a variety of communication strategies and events to get the types of feedback that we need, to coordinate on translation and use people in the community to help with translation, because we know a lot of the translation that occurs through our state contractors is not really that great. that there's cash stipends to support people. Currently, that's not something we really have the ability to do in state government without collecting a ridiculous amount of personal identifiable information, which doesn't seem appropriate. That there's going to be support for community leaders. Something that's been identified is that some of these communities do lack leaders that represent the community as opposed to having other people representing them. So one of the challenges is how do we build up or build some community capacity through this? And then assistance to community members on state-related things if specific things come up during the public outreach process. It's pretty open-ended, but at the same time, as the DEC, we do want to get input on how we communicate critical health information, at least, as far as drinking water, air quality, boil water notices. And then lastly, this isn't something we've talked about very much, but the Agency of Natural Resources Interim Language Access Plan is something we've been focusing a lot of emphasis on applying this across our agency and across our programs to make translation accessible when it is legally required by law under the Civil Rights Act. So that's potentially something for this council to think about, I think. In your next set of recommendations is to really provide more expectations on that, because I don't think the plan's been translated. I don't think parts of the plan have been translated, and that is really not compliant with federal regulations. I'm not saying that anybody is compliant 100%, but if we want to do it the right way, it's something to think about. So this is just a quick timeline of when these things are going to happen. In January, we are getting January 15th, we're going to get a work plan for the targeted outreach in these communities. So it would be helpful for us if the contract team could get some feedback, or at least have a meeting with this team sometime in January. And then they're going to move right into planning for the outreach events and then conducting the outreach events. And then we will get a final report on January 15th, 2023. Our goals for this work and what's in the final report is to really learn more about strategies that work and how well they work and how we can improve what we're doing. The department is going to be developing a public participation plan, so we want to have a better understanding of what we should put in that plan, as opposed to just writing the same old stuff that we always do. And we also want to work towards developing and supporting continuing leaders into the future, and also supporting work like this into the future. And then you'll just notice on the bottom here, two things that aren't going to be in this report and are not part of this work is definitions and identification of what's an environmental justice community in Vermont. That's something that obviously has been coming up a lot. What defines a disadvantaged community, what defines an EJ community, what even defines a frontline community exactly. There's a lot of different terms being used right now, and in Vermont, at least, I do not believe most of them have been defined with any indices or metrics. And then another project that the DEC is trying to work towards is developing a mapping tool. And when I say mapping tool, we're trying to develop an interactive informational mapping tool. So not one that would identify this is a community that you need to focus in, but a tool that will have demographic, environmental, and health related information for people to look at. So that's my quick summary.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Oh my gosh. Okay. So we have quite a few pieces of the puzzle on the table. And what Carrie brings to the picture here is the fact, and Chris puts it in the chat, of not only are we thinking about the way the Climate Council process and climate action planning does the kind of engagement you want to do, but how other agencies are trying to do similar work, whether it's what Carrie's doing in DEC, Chris mentions in the chat what VTrans is doing, right? So there's some questions there. I think what it'd be great to do is just have a conversation, and there's questions on the table right now, the ones that Meredith threw in the chat about, how to think about doing that partner engagement and how you all want to think about your role in that and the advice you have on that. And then what Carrie also brings, which is how might this be coordinated with other efforts going on out there? Kashka, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David. So I just, I would like to recognize what Pat had mentioned initially regarding public engagement. That's number one. And then it is so great and refreshing for me to hear about these other organizations, and including what Pat was just talking about, and I mean, including what Carrie was just discussing, because what it seems like to me is that we are all walking these parallel paths, but we are not walking the same path. We are just walking next to each other. And we all have that same goal in mind, but we are just not connecting. So I've been working with a team from Capstone Community Action to help engage the low and moderate income communities and their members. And I have to say, it has been a challenge. And I think as everyone who's been trying to do community outreach during COVID times, it is definitely challenging, but not also challenging because of COVID, but challenging because of, just as Carrie was pointing out, there's distrust, and there's simply, there's just not real organization. So there are a lot of challenges. Organizations have delayed or canceled events. Economic services, for example, is only opting on telephone interviews rather than in person. So trying to reach certain populations through those means is nearly impossible. Senior centers are closed. So a lot of organizations are having issues in reaching their intended audiences when it comes to public engagement. And then bringing people to the table that are not already actively engaged in this conversation is going to require time, and it's going to require resources. But it is work that, as we said from the beginning, and as Pat had stated, we took this challenge on from the beginning. We said we are going to do things differently. And I understand that time constraints, et cetera, have put a damper on our work, but we need to do this differently. And I think we need to build trust. So whether it's with listening sessions, et cetera, and we need to create value. We really need to create value in understanding and knowing about the plan, and creating value in its effects on frontline communities. So the conversation needs to change. We need to try to build a coalition and create, really, like, most importantly, a unified outreach campaign program. So there's all these different organizations, all these different consultants, everyone walking parallel next to each other. What if we did this as a collaborative effort? So meaning, let me see, I had written some things here, hold on. And I don't know if this already exists because I'm totally new to this, but is there like a listserv? And I think, was it Kara said that they have over 70 plus organizations already on board. So if we have a listserv of all these organizations that are already walking the same parallel paths, if we have a listserv of all those organizations and the people who are involved, if we also had a liaison coming from Just Transitions or from the Climate Council, stating all these different programs that are coming forth, and allowing these organizations to then access from a hub, say a hub that's been created by maybe Climate Access or CADMIS, where you can access marketing materials that are unified and available for, for every organization that wants them to give to their people. So hold on. Yeah, so what I would ask of the consultants, like Climate Access and or CADMIS, to create a hub where unified marketing materials can be easily accessed and used by any and all of the organizations to help with outreach efforts. So access to posters, mailers, postcards, flyers, brochures, leave behinds, whatever it is that they need. And then the way that we would move forward with the public engagement, obviously speaking out to everyone that is willing to listen and identifying those community members. And what we're gonna need is resources. We're going to need funding for this, because identifying those community leaders and having them go into the communities, we're gonna need to fund them. So I think that's it for now. Hold on. Yeah, and I don't want to go into the trenches, but that's part of it.
So I've been taking some notes, and I'll continue to do that tonight. And Kashka, I think you bring up a whole bunch of really powerful points. And so let's try as we go along to tease out the different pieces of those points. Like there's the coordination point, like we're walking down a similar path, but not together. Can we do it differently, right? You had some ideas there. There's some sort of harsh realities of this is really hard work, right? Made harder by a pandemic, made harder by the types of communities we're trying to get to, right? And then this issue of if we're going to identify folks, we're going to need to have the kind of funding available to help support people to play a role of being a community liaison or something like that. So trying to bucket up some ideas that I think you're pushing at, Kashka. Yeah.
Yes, and in addition,
yeah.
sorry, David, just in addition to that, having a unified marketing campaign where organizations can access materials, that would be huge. Instead of creating their own and everybody creating their own way of doing things, we would create this Vermont.
Can I ask?
We did that for the first phase. We created a whole packet for partners that had the event announcements. It had social media content you could use, backgrounders, etc. And that got emailed to that list of 70+ organizations. I wouldn't say those are all groups that are on board, but those are groups that were identified either by Just Transitions or other subcommittees or the council. But of that group, we did speak to 44 of those folks, and most were pretty much on board. So that is a list we've returned to. And then I believe the materials were shared on the Vermont Climate Change website as well. But that's part of what we're building out for this next phase, is a whole new set per the now initial plan.
I just wanted to follow up with that point, if it's okay, because I think that's what I heard from what Kara, you shared, that you're developing the next sort of iteration of materials that I think will at least help answer that goal that Kashka was reaching out, talking about. But what we're also wondering about is translation. Like that is something that Mona's not here, but I'm going to lift her up. She is begging for translated materials, and I'm wondering what the state is going to do about that. And interestingly, Carrie mentions that that's actually a requirement. So can we resource that? Obviously, that needs additional assistance. Jane, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't introduced her yet because we've been rolling, but our Director of Communications, Ella Casey, is on the call with us tonight too for A&R, and she's really been helping support Marion and I in our decisions, discussions, coordination with Climate Access and RISE. And Elle did look into language translation services and capacity to do that, both with the Climate Action Plan and then with our outreach materials. And Elle, I know that we have capacity to do it. I can't speak to at all levels. And if you remember the intricacies of that, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would appreciate it.
Sure. So we've been working on that, and we were working with the AALV, and they were happy to help us translate documents. I think one of the issues when I had last talked with them is that the Climate Action Plan itself is a really long document, so that would take them, they had said, at least a month to translate, and we didn't have it like a completed copy for them to be able to translate. So anyhow, they are able to translate that, and then other documents that we create as well. One of the things that I had talked with them about was that some of the words the more technical words that we're using are not translatable into some languages and instances, so that I don't know if others have run into that issue, or I guess like the need to stay true to the technical pieces that are in the plan, but then also wanting to be able to have those translated into different languages as best as possible. So anyhow, yes,
I would say, having looked at what Climate Access has put together, it's real high level, kind of simple, clear. I think that's the stuff that should get translated.
Yes.
As opposed to the plan itself. I don't want us to spend resources and time on that when the other stuff is what we're trying to reach people with, especially people we're trying to reach basic information who may not be thinking about this, and we think need to understand what's available even.
Yep.
Amanda?
So long story short, we're working with AALV on it.
Great.
Another consideration that had been brought up into our sphere was that a lot of these folks aren't even literate in their native tongue. So how we can get information out with that consideration, whether that's like a short audio recording or a little video or something, I think that should be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah. So one piece of this puzzle is materials that we're talking about now. Another piece of the puzzle is sort of really understanding who you're trying to reach out to, which is one of the questions that Kara had put in the chat, or Meredith put in the chat, and Kara had said. And the other is, what kind of conversation are you really expecting to have? And those are two questions I'd love to wrestle with for a little bit here, because you all are in a pretty good position to think about those questions of, what kind of conversation do you really expect to have if you were to go into different types of communities across the state? And where are those? Like, what are those priority communities if we were to put all of our good thinking to work here, and all of the actual connections we have in this Just Transition subcommittee? So I'd be interested to hear people's reactions to that, of who are we targeting? What's the conversation we expect to have in addition to the materials piece? Any thoughts? Kashka? Yeah.
So for example, I think when dealing with, or when trying to target people from low-income communities, the conversation has to change. It can't begin with climate action or environmental justice. And I think I've talked about this before. I think the conversation has to begin with, if you were able to have an electric vehicle tomorrow, would you or wouldn't you? Why or why not? What's preventing you from doing that? What's preventing you from trying to get a more environmentally friendly career instead of what you're doing currently? What's preventing you from A, B, or C? Or would you consider A, B, or C? Why or why not? So these are the kinds of conversations. They don't begin with climate, and they don't begin with environmental justice, because those are also politicized. And some of the communities that we go into, including the Northeast Kingdom, you are shutting off the conversation before it even starts. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, and I think that's exactly what I'm sort of encouraging folks to think about is, what does that conversation look like, right? And what's the material, if anything, you might need for that? And how do you project that out in a long-term fashion, right? If we said we wanted to sort of use this to build relationships, sort of how are you doing that over time? Other thoughts on that? I see Kelly in the chat, more listening than talking. Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
In the sustainable agriculture realm, you know, like through the sustainable ag working groups and through grants like Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, you know, there are all kinds of, like, you know, technology transfer among farmers, and, you know, transfer of ideas directly, you know, from farmer to farmer. And I really think we're going to need to have to start focusing on that with the climate action. More like actually show me real world examples, you know, people who I know and work with within my community. Not me personally, but you know what I'm saying. So I just think that we need to kind of, you know, it's almost a lot more like an extension function on climate change, you know, just like it used to be that extension agents back in the day, you know, would even work with home gardeners, you know, not just necessarily farmers. And, you know, you would organize groups like master gardeners, and those folk would work, you know, within their own communities. I know master gardeners is still a thing, but, you know, I think we need to almost create like a climate extension program where we actually get out and about and, you know, show real world examples. One of the examples I'm thinking about is like, you know, how do you actually achieve greater independence through electricity? Because a lot of people who may be nervous about changing can't imagine, you know, life without having access to the, you know, the heating oil and gasoline supply chain. But if we can actually have conversations about, wow, if you've got batteries in your car and you've got batteries in your house, your power goes out, you can power it for a limited amount of time. Even with a small solar array, you can keep everything going and not have to worry about what happens in Louisiana with a hurricane, or what happens between Russia and Georgia and the rest of Europe and the supply of natural gas and how that affects your gas prices. So to my mind, that's something that I would say we need to develop pretty fast, because we can't do it all ourselves.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, Jane.
Well, Chris went farther than I'm going to be able to respond to about sort of like outreach into communities around climate action. But I did just want to say that it's on my plate to send an email out that Marion, working with Elle and I, put together a Microsoft form that asks the question of counselors around stories, because as we think about how we expand upon the plan as drafted now, proofread it, and make it more user-friendly, one of the things that's surely missing is Vermonters seeing themselves in the plan. And so there's a form around asking for around the impact areas identified within the plan, and sort of the way we've been communicating that through our presentations and outreach, trying to lift up stories that have a personal connection, a municipal connection, or a regional state connection. And the form will go out to counselors to sort of provide ideas for stories that Elle, Marion, and I will all work on sort of over the course of this winter, interviewing, reaching out, writing those stories to include them in the updated version of the plan in the coming months. So I'm excited about that sort of next step with the plan, just for Vermonters to connect with.
Nice. Thanks, Jane. Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah, I just want to call up Danielle's comment in the chat box also about how this is just not on the mind of so many people. I think it's a great example. But I was thinking about your question, David, around what resources do we need to do this work differently, or what else do we need? And I think one of the things that keeps coming up for me is we want to engage trusted organizations in reaching the communities they're already engaged with. And but I think it's a tough ask. I think we are all in an era where our bandwidth is just really limited. And I think there are so many things trying to get our attention and say we're the most important thing. I think that's true for individuals, particular people in frontline communities who are balancing a lot of things, right? And I think it's also true for organizations that are trying to reach those communities. And so I think one of the resources that could be helpful is to have a person perhaps who is able to show up at those organizations, not just give them materials, but say, hey, can I come meet with you, talk about what it would be like to talk with your community, and how could I support you in doing this outreach, or what support do you need, or do you want me to come co-facilitate or co-show up, or how can I help you? So I feel like we need a person to sort of support that coordination effort, rather than just create materials and say, use these materials to engage with your community. So that's one thought I've had. And I think that person could support some of the coordination efforts that I'm seeing also mentioned in the chat box and in the conversation, just to sort of be a hub for some of that information sharing. So that's one thing. And I think, yeah, maybe I'll just stop right there. Other people have lots of great ideas. I'll stop there. But I also need to say, I'm so sorry, subcommittee. I'm going to have to drop off the Zoom meeting in just a moment, and then I'm going to join by phone, go to my kids' open house at school. Thanks.
Nice. Sarah, can I do a quick follow-up with you on the suggestion, like you really need this coordinator role, this person who can show up, do some of the legwork, take the pressure off, trusted community partner. Do you have a vision of how that person is, where they're housed or anything like that, that this committee might put up there? Like, is this someone who might be inside A&R? Is it somebody who, housed somewhere else?
Yeah, I think there's limitations to any place that you would house somebody or employ somebody. There's going to be limitations to that. It's going to have to be somebody, to all of our points, who can really listen and take some direction from those partner organizations, right? It's not about saying, here, do this. It's about saying, how can I help get this information to your community? How could we do this work together? Or how could we do it differently? So I think it could be through a contract. I think it could also be through a state employee. I think there's challenges to both models. But I think most important, I want to see some resources to help us do it.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Kashka?
I just wanted to second what Jane was saying also about the stories, and as well as Sarah with the liaison, or with a person or persons who would be able to listen more to these organizations and really offer their expertise or their help or their ear on how they can aid the efforts, the outreach efforts. And I also wanted to share with you all that through Capstone Community Action, we are putting together we have a Facebook page as well as a Facebook group. So the Facebook page is, it's still in the works. So don't try being our friend just yet, but it's, it's EJ Empower. And so Environmental Justice Empower, and our group to join would be Weathering the Storm. Vermonters discuss our ever-changing climate. And basically it's where you can share personal stories, photos, and videos of unusual and extreme weather events that have touched your lives and your community. And it's a place to share them, to discuss them, to talk. It's also a place to learn about different programs that can help Vermonters save money and put more money in their pockets. So plus you can learn more about how Vermont plans to tackle our ever-changing climate and how those decisions will affect you and your community. So share your stories, share your gripes, share your favorite eco-friendly products and solutions. And so we are trying to engage those that perhaps are a little bit more difficult to engage, like low-income Vermonters. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Kashka. Kara?
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say that we do have some capacity to do what Sarah suggested, and that's what I was actually hoping for, is that we have the spreadsheet already of more than 70 groups, and we'll email all of them, as I said, but I think what's important is for you all to take a look at that and note in there who you see as a priority for more of that direct follow-up, where we could email them, suggest a call, ask what would be most helpful, if they're willing to do outreach. So, and if it's an organization that you have a relationship with already, well, we're adding a column into the spreadsheet so you could note that, because I think if you already have a relationship, it's going to be a lot more powerful coming from you. We did talk with 44 folks from organizations to inform the public engagement plan at the outset. So we already do have a sense of what people are needing and hoping for. And part of it is materials, part of it is having, when needed, someone from the council or Just Transition or A&R come and be willing to speak about the plan. So I think that is something to figure out in terms of how we resource that. And we do have money in our budget to compensate organizations for the time they spend on this, whether that's doing outreach or if they're engaging their constituents and those folks need to be compensated for being part of a meeting or whatnot. We do have those funds available, but I think the first step is really prioritizing who really should be the focus of that more direct outreach.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah. And in that spirit, do we want to lift? I've been seeing some stuff in the chat, but you know, some of you have pathways into communities and groups. As member of the Just Transition Subcommittee, do we want to right now just say, yeah, there's some obvious starting places here in addition to the groups that Kara made contact with and her group made contact with back in June, July. Are there things we want to say right now, like, yep, we should do this, I'm available to help with this? Like, do folks have some sort of immediate thoughts about how to proceed with this sort of relationship building process? Sue?
Well, it sounds like you've got a great list started, Kara, that you want to add on to. Is that right? Or even do you need contacts for some of them? It sounded like you are connected with 40. Is that a starting place that you would like from us and other members of the council and other subcommittees?
Yeah, I know Elle did help populate a lot of contact information in the spreadsheet already, but if that's missing, adding email in would be great. But I think, and if there are groups missing, definitely add, but I think it's also a question of, to Sarah's point, you know, so we can email everyone, but we don't have time to follow up with every group and have that more one-on-one conversation. And so, you know, of the groups on that list, who's most important for us to be making sure we're connecting with and at least seeing if they can participate as a collaborator.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like a specific request of this group is to think about that prioritization and use that list perhaps as a way to spur that thinking.
Yeah, and we've added columns so you can mark, like, because we already were using it in terms of who should be interviewed and, you know, reached out to in different ways. And so we've added one on now that we have the initial plan, should they be a priority? And if so, who can follow up? And so if you have that relationship, that'd be great to know. And otherwise we'll reach out.
Yeah, I always get nervous of sharing documents with contact information and personal information and wide groups. So just might want to think about the process of sharing that doc. All right. Let me just share my notes for 1 second of these aren't necessarily going to totally nail it, but let me just today I'm just on one screen, so it's taken me a little bit longer to do things. Just give me 1 sec. I want to make sure we're capturing this well, and if we want to improve this, let's do it in real time. This is how I was taking notes from this conversation, a little bit crudely, but here are some of the highlights, right? We are committed to doing things quote unquote differently in the sense that we want to do this approach that really thinks about relationship oriented engagement, patient engagement, and engagement that recognizes we'll need to partner with folks to do it right. Lots of folks seem to be walking a similar path right now, but not necessarily together. What if we were able to be somewhat more collaborative on this? Kashka kicked us off with some ideas on this of, what if there's something more like a unified campaign or a liaison that helps channel information into groups? And then Sarah took that idea further to say, what if that person was actually taking some of the burden off trusted community leaders and others who we're trying to partner with, and is doing that work, the coordination, and actually showing up, right? So maybe this is the same person with multiple roles. We talked about that. We also talked about it's just plain hard, right? It's difficult work to reach out to these types of organizations in the middle of a pandemic. It's very challenging. And so we just need to be patient with ourselves too and recognize this difficult. And in that challenge, one of the responses is the conversation needs to change, right? And Kashka, I think, was the one who's talking about these are conversations that need to create value. It's very hard to start the conversation of like, let's talk about climate action or the climate action plan. It's actually probably easier to enter in with practical, concrete ideas about transportation, about jobs, about heating your home, etc. Chris brought to the table the idea of sort of the extension model, the technology transfer model, and it builds very much on this sort of practical, real world idea. Also on the table was using story, and Jane's mentioned how A&R is trying to lift that up right now, and that can be used more and more. And social media has a place too, and Capstone's getting the Facebook page going with that. And on translation, this is clearly front and center. There's a pathway that Elle described that they're working on it, and that seems to be in process. Whether it's moving at the speed it needs to move is another question. And on the who specifically, we really didn't go there as much. There's some activity in the chat, but we really didn't do that except to say we've got a list, and we can look at that list as a way of thinking about prioritization of where to invest time, precious time. So these were my notes, folks, and I'm happy to drop them or reshare them. And would folks want to correct them or improve them just to make sure we're capturing what are some of the key ideas coming out? Sue?
I think that you captured our conversation well. I feel a sense of we're not making decisions nor offering direction at this moment. I think we're capturing a lot of stuff and actually really condensing it into key points. I'm just wondering about whether it might make sense, and I'm wondering, Jane, would it be good to have a subgroup that can actually kind of maybe meet a little bit more often? We're about to talk about how often we're going to meet, and we're going to propose that we meet once a month. And I don't know if that's going to be enough, and if this whole group wants to continue to hash this out, or if some subgroup of this group, maybe there's others from other subcommittees too, who have connection to key community groups that would want to be a part of a team that's really working more closely with you and with climate access, and evolving these ideas. That's my question. I don't want to leave it sort of with this, but I do think you captured all the conversation very well, David.
Yeah, I think that's probably a great idea, because our hope is, especially with launching events, that will be end of January, early February. So we'll want to be really thinking thoughtfully about that, as well as additional partner events. We're meeting next Thursday internally with A&R to sort of set direction and priority for capacity around engagement, and then working with Climate Access to ensure we support them and implement additional work on top of that. So yeah, I think having
was this
that we know we yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, was this conversation helpful for that work?
Yeah, always.
Okay. Well, I feel like there's so much more to be talking about, and we will continue to visit it. But if there is some real feedback that you're interested in having, maybe there's a few people here who want to continue to be a resource for you, I guess is my question to the group. If you are interested in continuing to sort of dig in on some of this, why don't you put your name in the chat so that Jane will know that you can offer more time and energy towards this, if that's useful to the state. And we will continue, obviously, to have this conversation. And Chris put in the chat our obligation or responsibility under the Global Warming Solutions Act. That is pretty big.
Hey, Sue, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I was multitasking, which I have to do sometimes. This that you're referring to, I'm sorry, what is it again? Was it you're asking if you want to be part of? I'm sorry.
Yeah, a smaller group that probably will carry some of these ideas forward in between meetings of the Just Transition Subcommittee, which will probably shift to more like a monthly meeting.
Because I guess that's, I don't know how much time we're going to give to that last item as far as, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was called in the agenda, but Sue just mentioned what I put in chat. It's a big task that the Global Warming Solutions Act gives to this subcommittee. You know, I don't know if the intent was for us to be, watchdog is too strong a word, but you know what, oddly, it's odd to me that the act didn't give that responsibility to the council as a whole, but it basically says, hey, Just Transitions Subcommittee, you're responsible for making sure that the Global Warming Solutions Act results in a just transition. Good luck with that. So it seems like we just need to have I'm feeling like we just need to have just in my opinion, a structured conversation around what do we look like. I mean, it's fine to meet once a month, but I also feel like we kind of need to define our role within the context of the act and our capacity and expectations of the council and expectation. Yeah. There's a lot there. And one of the reasons I'm going back to it is in my signing statement around the voting in favor of the Global Warming Solutions Act, in favor of the cap, was that, we had to develop the Just Transitions principles kind of concurrently as we were having the policy discussions. But to my mind, now we've got the initial cap out there going forward. The policy really should, in my opinion, grow out of the Just Transitions framework, as opposed to trying to back the Just Transitions into policy, if it's really going to work. So anyway, to me, there's just some big questions out there. Others may not see it, and if that's the case, that's fine. Maybe I'm putting too much thought into it, but.
So I want to just thank folks who are willing to step up and help with this next step, because there's no way we're going to get it done if it's just, meeting with you once a month. And we did try to launch this whole partner outreach around the first phase, and we were really compressed by time. So we had a lot of conversations about it, but we never really got to traction. And so we're going to need to move quickly, because we've got the holidays now, preparations with the package of materials, but we need to be ready to hit the ground running in early January. in order to move these conversations along. And our work ends with you, which doesn't mean the process needs to, but our work ends with you at the end of March. So that's something I'm very mindful of. And in particular, given the comments at the front end of the meeting about the importance of doing things differently, we did not really fulfill what we were aiming to do in the first phase. We had the time compression. We also had the challenges with the BIPOC affinity group. So this really is an important opportunity to really be thoughtful about outreach to community organizations and how we engage partners. And so, yeah, thanks to everyone who's willing to work with us on that. And we'll work with Jane to follow up and set up a conversation to advance that work.
Thank you, Cara. We just have a minute left. And Chris, you landed a big question. I think we have a specific charge that we kind of created at the beginning. I think we need to review that charge. Obviously, the language that you're talking about, and the council as a whole needs to think about it, and perhaps the steering committee more specifically. I would like us to decide or give some feedback. Sarah and I were throwing around how often we should meet going forward, and we thought once a month. I'm sure many of you, like me, can't keep going at this pace. So we were hoping that once a month. That's why I'm hoping that people who have motivation around public engagement can be part of that. It might make sense, Chris, for a few of us to think about what is our charge going forward. But I'm hoping we can stick with Thursdays, but hoping we can avoid the third or fourth Thursday, which is when I have my board meeting and always have to pop off. So we were going to propose the second Thursday at this time frame. Is there anyone who is a part of this ongoing, for whom that's a problem or wants to propose something else? Hearing none, we'll take that as a let's go with the second Thursday, once a month. We'll try to get we can email, I think, somewhat to decide if there are tasks that need to be worked on between then. I thank everyone for being here and for not just their presence, but their contributions. I especially thank the staff and our consultants who really have been giving of themselves and working very hard. It is quite an accomplishment, the document that got put together. We have done a tremendous amount of public engagement, and we aren't yet reaching the groups that we want to reach, but we're digging in and new things are happening and will continue to evolve. So thank you all for being a part of this. Unless anyone has something else that they want to say to conclude this evening, I will say for some, there are holiday celebrations ahead. For some, they've already been happening. For some, this is not a holiday season, but for whatever you do, I hope and bless you in this time, and we will see you in the new year. Stay safe, wear your mask, get vaccinated, be good. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sue.
Take care, everybody.